May my hands be holy when I kneel in prayer. May my life be holy when I praise. Help me, Lord, respect the role you've given me. May I serve with honor all my days. May I serve with honor in the role you've given me. And may I never go beyond my place as I serve my Savior and I give you praise. Help me follow the truth and I'll be saved. May my hands be holy when I kneel in prayer. May my life be holy when I praise. Help me, Lord, respect the role you've given me. May I serve with honor all my days.
Welcome. Today I would like for us to take a look at the birth of Jesus from Matthew's Gospel. Really, if you want to follow along in your own Bible, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 1 and 2. So I'm not going to read all of those chapters by any means in this video. So if you want to, maybe this afternoon after you get done with this, you might just sit down and read those whole chapters. All of chapter 1, all of chapter 2, and you'll get something great about the birth of Jesus from Matthew's Gospel. So throughout the rest of the month of December, what I want us to do is I want us to take a look at different passages about Jesus' birth from each one of the Gospels. So this week is Matthew's, next week we'll go on to Mark, and then we'll go to Luke, and then we'll go to John. And that will kind of take us throughout the Sundays of December. I've just been really thinking about the birth of Jesus, and sometimes, this time of year it makes sense for us to think about that. But then I also want us to know, what does the Bible actually say about his birth and the importance of each thing that is stated there. So for starters, in this lesson, when we take a look at Matthew's Gospel, what I want us to see from this is Matthew keeps talking about the different prophecies that are fulfilled. And the way that I think about prophecies are kind of like puzzle pieces. I don't know how many of you necessarily do puzzles, but you got all these pieces here together. And whenever you look at the small things of it, you can kind of see a little bit of a picture, but you don't necessarily know really what all that is about. Like, you can kind of see that there's trees in there. I don't know how well you can see it on this video necessarily. But you can only see like little bits and pieces unless you have the box, right, with the whole cover that has the whole thing. And I don't know how many of you would even dare to try to put together the puzzle pieces without having that big picture of seeing it. But I think in many ways, that's what happens whenever we come to Jesus being the Messiah, is we've got all of the pieces throughout the page of the Old Testament. But sometimes they're a little confusing, and sometimes they're only like bits and pieces of the big picture. But whenever Jesus came, who is that exact image of God himself, and you see the big picture of what's going on with him, then, and really only then, can you see just how well all of those other puzzle pieces fit together to create this beautiful picture. So I hope that maybe kind of gets you thinking about the picture of Jesus that we see, and especially in the birth of Jesus. Now, let's take a look from Matthew's Gospel. Matthew starts off his gospel by stating in Matthew 1:1, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then it goes on, line after line after line, about how so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, was the father of so-and-so. And then, you get in just, if you go on down to verse 5, you see that Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse. And then it just keeps going, throughout all of the line. And then as you get to the very end of that in verse 17, we read, thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. So you see here in all of this that, yes, this is the line from which Jesus came. It's important that he was a son of Abraham. I mean, that all Jews really were, but it was also important that he was a son of David. And those things we'll kind of take a look at in a little bit more detail in a moment. But this whole list, of course, all of these men that are in this list are going to be Jews. But yet Matthew does something that would have kind of got your attention. He lists a few women here in this genealogy. which is, to us that kind of makes sense because we want to know who their father and their mother is. They didn't care as much about that during this time. They just listed the father. So, the Salmon was the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse. That's how most of it reads. But right here in verse 5, you see that about someone's mother being Rahab and someone's mother being Ruth right there. So Rahab and Ruth are both mentioned. Now we won't look at the other names that are mentioned here, but these two, we clearly see something in common between the two of them. Yes, they're related to one another, but also Rahab, was she a Jew? No, she was a Gentile. So in this list of Jewish people, all these Jewish men, one of the ways that Matthew is able to talk about Gentiles is by listing these women. Rahab, she came from a pagan background, but she decided to devote herself to the one true and living God of the Bible. Same with Ruth. Ruth was a Gentile, but she became a part of the children of God. So all of the men are Jews in this list, but the women have an interesting connection with the Gentiles because we find in Jesus the Messiah that yes, he is a Jew and he came here for the Jews, but he also came for the Gentiles. Even in his genealogy, we see that all people are included. It's a beautiful way and a wonderful way and something we can easily pick up on because let's face it, we don't like to read so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so. We don't like to read all of those things, but they are important and they teach us that Jesus is for all. He's for men, he's for women, he's for Jew, he's for Gentile. That covers us all. But Jesus is not done with just his ministry and all of it. This is just where he came from. There's so much more about it though. If you skip on down now to verse 18. In verse 18, Matthew continues the story and he says, "This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit." I mean, this is something that we oftentimes talk about. Even we have some songs about Mary and being the virgin and all. And yes, it's kind of a strange story, but in this we see something about the history of Jesus the Messiah and how he came about, because his birth is very important. When you look at Jesus, you see that his mother was Mary, but Jesus' father is not really Joseph, at least not physically speaking. The father of Jesus is God himself through the Holy Spirit. So that means that Jesus is he's a one-of-a-kind person. He is this Messiah who came. He is both God, but he's also a human being in order to come here as a human being, to live among us, and to teach us what it means to be a human. We also find out that this clearly tells us it's not as if Jesus, throughout his ministry, that like he was a great guy and then all of a sudden God decided to make him the Messiah. That's not the history of Jesus. Jesus was already the Messiah from before his birth. That's pretty powerful. That's pretty important. This is Jesus, the Messiah. Verses 20 through 23 also kind of talks about how all of these things, it took place. Well, I'll just read it. "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. The name God with us was connected to a child. And that child was connected to one who was going to be born to a virgin. And this is related to Jesus himself, because Jesus is God with us. Now, that's very similar to what God's desire has been throughout history, isn't it? When you trace the history of God with us, God wanted to be with us in the garden. But he found out whenever he started walking in the garden with Adam and Eve, they had already sinned. They had messed up. And they had messed up that relationship. But God wasn't done. He still wanted to be with us. And we see that time and time again, and we see that he heard the outcry of his people during the days of the Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, we read about how he designed this tent to where he could be with us. And that tent, we call it a tabernacle. And they would go and they would worship. And later that tabernacle became the temple. And now here in Matthew's gospel, at the very beginning, we see that Jesus is the way that God is with us. He became one of us. It's amazing that God would love us that much, that he wants to be with us. Even though we're messed up and we sin and we just constantly throw monkey wrenches into God's plan, God still wants to be with us. And he most certainly was in the person of Jesus Christ. now chapter 2 together. In Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we read this. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Now, these magi that are described in verse 1, or these wise men, we oftentimes know them as that, they are Gentiles. From everything that we can gather about them, whatever you want to make about them coming from the east, okay, they could be pretty close east, or they could be, really far away. Whatever the case, they weren't really the insiders. They weren't Jews themselves. Why else would they come in verse 2 and say, "We've heard about this one who's born King of the Jews"? Why wouldn't they just say that he was born and he's our king? That's because they're not Jews. They are from a distance. So these magi come, they're Gentiles, and they worship Jesus. That goes back to even his genealogy, right? He's not just the king of the Jews. He's also the king of the Gentiles as well. So when these wise men or the magi, they come, they decide that they're going to start asking questions with the current king, King Herod himself. Now, whenever they ask about him, well, Herod, of course, is pretty interested. What is going on? Herod is the one who is king. So what does this mean that these foreigners are coming in and they're asking this about this king who's just been born that's going to be the king of the Jews? What? Does King Herod have a rival? Well, he wants to find out. In verses 4 and 6, we read that when King Herod had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." So from the place of Bethlehem, which is known as the city of David, by the way, because he was a son of David, we see that there's a new king that is coming, the rightful king. And Herod, whenever he hears that it's out of Bethlehem, there's going to be a ruler. Well, Herod wants this king out of his way. And whenever he does that, Joseph is revealed that he needs to do something to keep Jesus safe. So in verses 14 and 15, we read that so Joseph got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Now, that prophecy was originally just talking about Israel, because out of Egypt, God called Israel, right? But right now we see that this is kind of getting reenacted in some way, but with an interesting little twist. Because the people of God originally went to Egypt, and they went there for safety and security, but then as they remained there, they became enslaved, right? And that's why they were called out of it. That's what the book of Exodus is about. But now, even the child of God, Jesus himself, goes into Egypt, and he went there for refuge, and it's a place where there was refuge. But at some point, he came out of Egypt. There's a connection between this story about Jesus Christ and Moses himself. It was even prophesied that there's going to be another prophet like Moses, and that everyone must listen to him. I believe what Matthew is doing is he's hinting at, hey, there's this idea that there's going to be a new Moses. It's Jesus. We need to listen to him. Because just like during the days of Moses, there was that Pharaoh who killed the innocent babies, right? Trying to stamp out and get rid of those that he thought were out to get him. Well, that same thing happened during the days of Jesus, because whenever Jesus was around, what Herod did is he had all the baby boys to be killed. And that's actually a sad thing that's referenced in verses 17 and 18, that then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. So just like with Moses, there was Pharaoh who was killing the innocent babies. Now during the time of Jesus, there is Herod who has killed these innocent babies as well. Herod is putting himself in the place of Pharaoh. And you might look at this and you might think, well, this kind of brings us down a little bit, doesn't it? I mean, this is an odd way to start. We're only the second chapter in, and we're hearing about babies being put to death. It's not good. But when you look at the story that Matthew records for us, you find out that Jesus himself, around his birth and his death, they are both surrounded with some type of sadness. But all the while that they are surrounded with that sadness, which is kind of just how we experience life, isn't it? We oftentimes experience life with bits of sadness within it. But even among that, with Christ, what we see hope. Because Jesus is so powerful and he has overcome and he gives our life meaning. He gives our life hope. He gives us hope that we can have a better life even as well. So as we look at these first two chapters and we see the birth of Jesus, we find hope coming into the world. And with Jesus, and kind of summarizing some of these things we looked at, we see that Jesus, the Messiah, he is God with us. And of course, by physical birth, he came to us through the Holy Spirit. It's a very unique situation, but it's a wonderful one that gives us hope. And Jesus, the Messiah, we also find out that he is from Bethlehem, that city of King David. And he is the prophesied king that is going to sit on the throne of David and rule forever. Speaking of that, we find out that Jesus, the Messiah, is the King of the Jews, but not just the King of the Jews, but the King of the Gentiles, and really the King of all kings. He is the King. And we find out that Jesus, the Messiah, he is like Moses. And just like Moses was given the task to lead God's children out of the land of slavery and into the promised land, that's the call of Jesus as well. And he not only is leading us, but he made the way for us to go through his death on the cross. Jesus the Messiah, he is our life, and he is the one that we are called to follow as he leads us to the final promised land. I hope that if you haven't made the decision yet to follow Jesus, that you will choose today to follow Jesus into the new promised land, that new life where all things will be made new. It's a wonderful story, and we get the privilege of following Jesus through it.
Do you know, little child, what is in you? Can you dream, little child, of going far? Do you know, little child, of the power you've been given? Do you know, little child, whose you are? You were made in the image of God, just a little bit below the angels. And the masterpiece of heaven's hand is your body and your soul. You were made in the image, you were made in the image, you were made in the image of God, in the image of God. Do you see, child of God, who is in you? Do you see, child of God, where you belong? Do you see, child of God, Christ the Lord who dwells within you? Do you see, child of God, who makes you strong? You were made in the image of God, just a little bit below the angels. And the masterpiece of heaven's hand is your body and your soul. You were made in the image, you were made in the image, you were made in the image of God, in the image of God. Do you care, precious one, who is in you? Do you care, precious one, who's in your soul? Do you care, precious one, for the temple of the Spirit? Do you care, precious one, to be whole? You were made in the image of God, just a little bit below the angels. And the masterpiece of heaven's hand is your body and your soul. You were made in the image. You were made in the image. You were made.